I found a positive drug test in my kid's bathroom. The truth destroyed our family dinner. I stood frozen in my 3 kids' bathroom, staring at the positive drug test strip laying on the counter next to the toothpaste. THC positive. My vision went red as I snatched it and stormed down the hallway toward the dining room where I could hear laughter. I slammed the test on the table between the mashed potatoes and gravy. Which one of you is doing drugs? Meal, my oldest at 17, dropped his fork onto his plate with a clatter. Dad, what the? Don't you dare curse at me! I roared, my face burning. Military school applications are online. I can have you enrolled by Monday morning. Antigone, 15, went sheet white. Her hands started shaking. Dad, please, Uncle Liam is here. She glanced nervously at my brother, who was staring intently at his plate, not moving. Gus, my youngest at 13, slowly grabbed the breadbasket and pulled it closer. This gonna be wild, he whispered, already pulling out his phone. Put that away, I snapped. Gus just angled it better. It's not mine. Meal stood up so fast his chair tipped backward. I'm trying to get a D1 scholarship. You think I'm that stupid? They drug test athletes. Then whose is it? I pointed at each of them like a prosecutor. This was in your bathroom. Someone in this house is using drugs, and we're not leaving this table until someone confesses. I've been selling my ADHD meds, Antigone blurted out, then immediately slapped both hands over her mouth. The room went dead silent. Even Gus stopped chewing his bread. You've been what? My voice dropped deadly quiet. Not using! Just selling. Tears streamed down her face. Kids pay me $50 during finals week and I needed money for, she hiccuped, for therapy. Because you won't pay for it since you think anxiety isn't real and I should just toughen up. I staggered. Antigone. While we're doing confessions, Meal jumped in, his face red. I've been failing math. I'm not graduating unless I pass summer school, and I already paid the deposit for college, so this isn't about grades. I slammed my hand on the table. Every plate jumped. Uncle Liam flinched so hard he knocked over his entire glass of water across the tablecloth. Sorry, I'm sorry, Liam mumbled, using his napkin to frantically sop up water. His hands were shaking worse than Antigone's. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Also, I kissed Tim Moriga and I think I'm gay, Meal shouted, apparently deciding to completely implode his life. What? I spun back to him. Or bi. I don't know yet, but Tim's definitely gay and we've been— Stop talking! I held up my hand. Just— Gus! I whirled on my youngest. Do you have anything to confess? Gus, mouthful of bread, considered this. I've been running a gambling ring for Pokemon cards at school. Made $300 last month. Gus! What? You asked! This is insane! I grabbed the drug test, waving it. One of you is lying. This didn't just magically appear. Actually, Gus swallowed his bread and pointed at the test with his butter knife. That's not even the kind from CVS. That's from the rehab clinic on Maple Street. Everyone turned to stare at him. What? I watch YouTube videos about, how do you know what rehab clinic tests look like? I demanded, my stomach dropping. Google exists, Dad. Plus Uncle Liam has those exact pamphlets in the basement. They fell out of his bag when— Liam stood up so fast his entire plate crashed to the floor. China shattered, mashed potatoes splattered across the hardwood. I can explain. His voice was barely a whisper. The test wasn't my kids. I stared at my brother, who I'd invited to stay with us 8 weeks ago after he lost his job. Rough patch, he'd called it. Just needed to get back on his feet. I'm trying to get clean. Liam's voice cracked, tears rolling down his face. I test myself every week. I've been clean for 6 weeks, but I still test to make sure, and I must have left it when I used the kids' bathroom this morning because the basement toilet was clogged and— He looked at my children's faces. Meal's mouth hung open. Antigone had stopped crying from pure shock. Gus had his phone pointed directly at Liam. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anyone to know. Uncle Liam, Antigone whispered. Is that why you've been going to those meetings? He nodded, unable to speak. And why you won't come to restaurant dinners? Meal asked quietly. Because your old dealer works downtown? Liam's face crumpled. I stood in my own dining room, surrounded by the family I'd just traumatized. I'm in recovery, Liam sobbed. The test proves I'm— Red and blue lights flooded through the windows. 2 officers were at the door. We're responding to a live stream showing drug possession and minors in danger, the officer said. The officers stepped into our dining room and I couldn't move. My brain kept replaying what Gus's phone had captured. The drug test accusation. Antigone confessing to selling pills. Meal's sexuality revelation. Liam's addiction admission. All of it streamed live to who knows how many people. The taller officer looked at me and gestured toward the kitchen. The shorter one stayed with my family, pulling out a notepad. I walked on legs that felt like someone else's, my hands shaking worse than they'd ever shaken before. The kitchen felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in as the officer closed the door behind us. He asked me to explain the situation, and I tried, stumbling over words about my brother staying with us and recovery programs and bathroom mix-ups. The officer's face stayed blank, professional, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Every word out of my mouth sounded more ridiculous than the last. He asked why my 13-year-old son was filming instead of getting help if there was really a drug situation. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. What could I say? That I'd created such a toxic environment my own kid thought live streaming family destruction was more valuable than stopping it? The officer wrote something in his notebook and I wanted to grab it, see what judgment he was recording about my parenting. He asked if there were drugs in the house currently. I said no, just the test strip, which proved someone was clean not using. He asked if I was sure. I said yes, but my voice cracked on the word, and I sounded guilty of something I hadn't even done. The officer walked back to the dining room and I followed, my stomach churning. He went straight to Liam and asked him directly about the test. My brother's hands shook so badly he could barely pull his wallet from his back pocket. He fumbled with it, cards spilling onto the table among the mashed potato stains, finally finding his NA meeting attendance card. The officer examined it under the dining room light, checking dates and signatures. Liam explained his recovery program in a voice I'd never heard from him before, small and ashamed and desperate to be believed. He talked about weekly testing himself to stay accountable, about the basement toilet being clogged this morning, about using the kids' bathroom and forgetting the test strip by the sink. The officer's expression softened slightly as he handed the card back, but then he turned to Antigone. He asked her about the ADHD medication confession he'd heard on the live stream. Antigone's face crumpled and fresh tears started rolling down her cheeks. She tried to explain through sobs about needing therapy money, about kids paying her during finals week, about only selling it a few times. The officer held up his hand to stop her and explained that selling prescription medication was illegal, regardless of her age or intentions. He said it didn't matter that she was 15, or that she thought she had a good reason. The law was the law, and he was required to file a report. Antigone sobbed harder, her whole body shaking. The officer's voice got gentler as he recommended we get her into legitimate therapy immediately and cooperate fully with the school investigation that would definitely happen now that it was on video. He looked at me when he said that last part, like this was my fault for not getting her help before it came to this. The officers asked more questions for what felt like hours, but was probably only 60 minutes. They wanted to know about Liam's recovery timeline, about Antigone's prescription history, about how long Gus had been filming before they arrived. They asked Neil about his confession too, the math class failure, and he had to explain the whole college deposit situation while the officers took notes. Finally, they closed their notebooks and gave us warnings about family dysfunction and getting proper help and making sure the kids were safe. They said someone from the school would be contacting us, and possibly child services depending on their investigation. Then they left, and the red and blue lights disappeared from our windows. We sat in horrible silence staring at the destroyed dinner table, mashed potatoes still splattered on the floor from Liam's dropped plate, the drug test strip lying in gravy, water stains on the tablecloth. Gus finally lowered his phone, the screen going dark. He said his battery died, and I realized my youngest son had just broadcast our family's complete meltdown to his entire social media following. 3,000 people, 5,000 people, maybe more had watched us implode. I told all 3 kids to go to their rooms. Neil stood up first, his chair scraping against the floor. Antigone followed, her face blotchy and swollen from crying. Gus grabbed 2 rolls from the breadbasket before leaving because apparently family trauma doesn't stop a 13-year-old's appetite. I sat down at the kitchen table across from Liam. Neither of us could speak at first. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Liam started apologizing, over and over, saying he was so sorry for leaving the test in their bathroom, for bringing his problems into my house, for everything. I listened to him apologize and realized I'd been so focused on controlling my kids that I'd completely missed my own brother's struggle happening under my roof. He'd been living in my basement for 8 weeks, and I never noticed he was fighting for his life every single day. Liam told me he'd been attending NA meetings every Tuesday and Thursday night. I'd thought those were job interviews or networking events, had even asked him how they went, and were accepted his vague answers without question. He explained he'd been clean for 6 weeks after losing his job due to missing work during his active addiction. He came to stay with us hoping a stable environment would help his recovery, but he was terrified to tell me the truth. I asked him why he didn't tell me, why he hid something so important. His answer hit me like a punch to the chest. He said he would have judged him the same way I judge my kids for not being perfect. The truth of that statement sat between us like a third person at the table, undeniable and damning. Around midnight, I went to check on each kid separately. I started with Gus because his room was closest. I knocked and pushed open the door to find him sitting on his bed, his phone plugged into the charger, refreshing the screen over and over. The video already had 3,000 views with hundreds of comments scrolling past. I watched my son's face cycle between pride at the attention and growing fear about consequences. Some comments called our family a mess. Others felt sorry for us. A few made jokes about the mashed potatoes. Gus kept scrolling, reading every single one, his expression changing with each new notification. I confiscated the phone from his hands and he protested but didn't fight me. I found Antigone sitting on her bed staring at the wall, not crying anymore but completely shut down. Her eyes didn't track me as I entered. I tried to apologize, stumbling through words about being sorry for how I reacted and not listening before. She finally looked at me and said, "I think anxiety isn't real, so why would I believe she needed therapy?" I stood there with no response that didn't prove her point completely right. I walked down the hallway to Meal's room and pushed open his door without knocking. The room was empty. His bed sat unmade, covers thrown back like he'd left in a hurry. The window stood wide open with the screen pushed out, leaning against the side of the house below. Cold air poured into the room. I crossed to the window and looked down at our backyard, seeing nothing but darkness and the fence line. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Meal lit up the screen telling me he was staying at Tim's house tonight and needed space to think. My fingers hovered over the keyboard ready to type that he needed to get home right now, that running away solved nothing, that we weren't done talking. I stared at those words forming in my head and deleted them before typing. I texted back that we'd talk tomorrow. My hand shook as I hit send. I closed Meal's window and picked up the screen from outside, fitting it back into place. The house felt too quiet as I walked back through the hallway past Antigone's closed door and Gus's room where I could hear him breathing in sleep. I went to my own bedroom and lay down on top of the covers, still wearing my clothes from dinner. The ceiling fan spun above me in the darkness. I kept seeing the dining room table, the test strip landing between the mashed potatoes, my hand slamming down, making all the plates jump, Antigone's hands shaking, my voice roaring about military school before I even knew what was happening. Liam's plate crashing to the floor, mashed potatoes spreading across the hardwood in a white puddle. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard myself yelling, "Which one of you is doing drugs?" like I was interrogating criminals instead of talking to my own kids. The memory of Antigone saying I think anxiety isn't real played over and over. She was right. I did think that. I told her to toughen up when she asked for therapy, said she just needed to try harder, that everyone gets nervous sometimes. My explosive anger the second I found that test made everyone so scared they started confessing things they'd been hiding for months. Antigone selling her medication for 4 months, Meal failing math all year, even Gus's Pokemon card gambling that I never noticed. All of them carrying these huge secrets because they were too afraid to tell me. I rolled over and checked my phone. 2:47 a.m. Meal hadn't texted again. I wondered if he was actually at Tim's house or somewhere else. I wondered if Tim's parents knew he was there, or if Meal climbed through a window there too. My brain wouldn't stop making lists of everything that could go wrong. I got up and walked through the house, checking that all the doors were locked, that Antigone and Gus were still in their rooms, that Liam was downstairs in the basement. Everyone was where they should be except Meal. I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until the sky started getting lighter outside my window. The coffee maker was halfway through brewing when my phone rang. The school principal's name appeared on the screen. I answered and she said they needed to meet that afternoon about Antigone's medication situation and Gus's live stream. Her voice sounded tired and careful, like she was picking each word. I agreed to come in at 2 o'clock, my stomach already twisting at the thought of sitting in her office. She thanked me for being cooperative and hung up. I poured my coffee and sat at the kitchen table where we'd eaten dinner last night. Someone had cleaned up the broken plate and mashed potatoes while I was checking on the kids. The tablecloth was gone, probably in the wash. I picked up my phone and looked at Meal's text again, then set it down and drank my coffee even though it burned my tongue. Meal came through the front door around 10 in the morning, looking like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were red and his hair stuck up on one side. He dropped his backpack by the door and walked into the kitchen where I was still sitting with my second cup of coffee. We both sat down at the table without saying anything at first. He picked at a scratch in the wood surface. I wrapped both hands around my mug. Finally, he started talking, telling me he'd been seeing Tim for 3 months now. They had English class together and started talking after school, then hanging out on weekends when I thought he was at basketball practice or studying at the library. He said he was terrified to tell me because of how I react when anything unexpected happens. He used the word terrified, and I felt it like a punch. My son was terrified of me. He explained that he didn't know if he was gay or bi yet, that he was still figuring it out, but he knew he liked Tim, and that was real. I sat there listening and realized Meal had been carrying this huge part of who he was in complete secret, going to the school every day and coming home and pretending everything was normal while hiding someone he cared about. I asked him about the math class, trying to keep my voice steady instead of angry. He explained he'd been struggling since September when they started trigonometry. He didn't understand the concepts, and every time he asked the teacher for help, she told him to review the textbook. He fell further behind each week until he was failing every test. He said he was afraid to ask me for help because I always say just work harder, instead of actually helping him understand things. The college deposit came from his summer job savings from working at the grocery store, money he'd been saving for a car. He paid the deposit in January thinking he'd figure out the math situation, but then it got worse and he panicked. Now he was looking at losing the money and not graduating and watching his whole future fall apart. He said all of this while staring at the table, not looking at me once. I drove to the school at 1:45 and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes before going inside. The principal's office smelled like coffee and paper. She gestured for me to sit in one of the chairs across from her desk. She folded her hands on top of a manila folder and explained that Antigone could face suspension or even expulsion for selling prescription medication. The school board had policies about drug distribution on campus, even though Antigone claimed she only sold to kids at their houses after school. They were required to report it to the police beyond what happened last night with the officers at our house. She said the best thing I could do was get a lawyer and show the school board that we were taking serious corrective action with therapy and supervision. She recommended family counseling and individual therapy for Antigone, drug testing, and a written plan for how we'd prevent this from happening again. Her tone was professional, but I could hear the judgment underneath every word. Then she opened the folder and pulled out printed screenshots from Gus's live stream. She said several students and parents saw the video before it ended, and some had already contacted the school with concerns. Gus would face consequences for bringing negative attention to the school and violating the acceptable use policy for technology. But her main concern, she said while looking directly at me, was the family dysfunction the video displayed. She asked if the children were safe at home. She asked if there was domestic violence. She asked if anyone was abused or neglected. I answered no to everything while feeling my face burn hot. She made notes in the folder. She said she was required to document our conversation and that she'd be following up to make sure Antigone started therapy and that the family situation improved. She handed me a list of family therapists who took our insurance. I left the school and drove straight to Antigone's doctor's office. The receptionist squeezed me in for a late afternoon appointment. The doctor came in looking at her tablet, then sat down and asked why I was there. I explained that Antigone had been selling her ADHD medication to other students. The doctor's face changed completely. She asked why Antigone needed money for therapy when she already had a prescription and regular appointments. I admitted I'd refused to pay for talk therapy because I thought the medication was enough. The disappointment on her face was obvious. She didn't try to hide it. She set down her tablet and asked how long I'd been denying Antigone therapy. I said about a year, maybe longer. The doctor nodded slowly like this explained everything. She told me that ADHD medication without behavioral therapy was like giving someone crutches, but not teaching them how to walk. The medication helped Antigone focus, but didn't teach her how to manage her anxiety or develop coping strategies. She pulled up Antigone's chart and showed me notes from appointments where Antigone had asked for therapy referrals. The requests went back 14 months. The doctor had given Antigone names of therapists each time, and Antigone said she'd talk to me about it. Apparently she did talk to me and I said no every time. The doctor wrote a letter right there supporting therapy as a medical necessity. She printed it and handed it to me, then suggested I examine why I was so resistant to my daughter getting the help she'd been begging for. She said it in a kind voice, but the words still felt like an accusation because they were true. I got home around 6 and called everyone into the living room for a family meeting. Antigone came down the stairs and sat in the armchair furthest from me, staring at the wall instead of looking at anyone. Gus bounced into the room asking if he was going to be famous from the video, if anyone at the school had mentioned it yet, how many views it got. Neil sat on the couch between where Gus plopped down and where Antigone was curled up, creating a barrier between his siblings and me. Liam hovered in the doorway to the living room like he wasn't sure if he should be included in this meeting or if it was just for the kids. I told him to come in and sit down. He perched on the edge of the other armchair, looking ready to run. I started trying to apologize for my reaction at dinner, but it came out wrong, full of justifications about being shocked and worried when I found the test. Antigone finally looked at me and said I wasn't worried. I was angry that they weren't perfect. The accuracy of that statement cut through every excuse I was trying to make. I sat there trying to find words that would fix what I'd broken, but everything that came out sounded like I was defending myself instead of actually apologizing. I kept explaining how shocked I was, how worried, how I didn't know what to think when I found that test. Antigone stared at the wall while I talked, her arms wrapped around herself. She finally turned her head and looked straight at me. She said I wasn't worried. I was angry that they weren't perfect. The words landed like a punch. I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out because she was completely right. I wanted to tell her that wasn't true, but we both knew it was. The silence stretched out until Gus started bouncing his leg up and down, making the couch shake. I cleared my throat and said we needed to discuss consequences for what happened. Antigone's face went blank again. Neil sat up straighter and I could see his jaw tighten. I started listing what needed to happen about the medication selling and the live stream, but Neil cut me off. He said I was already planning punishments instead of asking why they felt like they had no other choice. The observation hit me the same way Antigone's comment had. I was doing exactly what I always did, jumping straight to discipline without trying to understand. Liam shifted in his chair and said maybe everyone needed some space to calm down. Antigone stood up without looking at anyone and walked upstairs. Her bedroom door closed with a solid thunk that wasn't quite a slam but close. Neil followed a minute later. Gus asked if he could go play video games and I just nodded. He practically ran out of the room. I sat alone in the living room with Liam, both of us staring at the empty chairs where my kids had been. He said I should probably give them time. I said I didn't know what I was supposed to do differently. He didn't have an answer for that. The next morning, I sat at my computer after the kids left for school and typed "family therapist near me" into the search bar. My finger hovered over the enter key for a full minute before I pressed it. I'd always thought therapy was for weak people who couldn't handle their own problems, people who needed someone else to tell them how to live. The search results loaded, and I scrolled through pages of therapist profiles, reading their specialties and approaches. One name kept appearing in the reviews, Feng Zhao, with parents saying he helped them understand their kids better and fix broken relationships. I clicked through to his website and read about authoritarian parenting styles versus authoritative ones. The description of authoritarian parents made me uncomfortable because it sounded like someone describing me. Strict rules, high expectations, punishment-focused, little warmth or flexibility. I kept reading even though I wanted to close the browser. The effects on children section listed anxiety, low self-esteem, difficulty making decisions, fear of failure, poor communication. I thought about Antigone's shaking hands and Meal's confession that he was afraid to ask for help with math. The website had links to articles about how kids raised with authoritarian parenting often hide problems until they explode. I spent 3 hours reading articles and studies, taking notes, highlighting passages that felt like reading my own biography. Every description of how authoritarian parents interact with their kids matched what I did. The belief that respect means fear. The idea that showing emotion is weakness. The assumption that strict control prevents problems instead of creating them. I finally closed my laptop around noon, feeling like I'd just read an instruction manual for everything I'd done wrong. 2 days later, the school called. The principal wanted to see me and Gus that afternoon about the live stream incident. I picked Gus up from his last class, and we walked to the main office in silence. The principal's secretary pointed us to the waiting chairs. Gus swung his legs and played with his phone until the door opened. The principal gestured us inside, and we sat across from her desk. She pulled up the video on her computer and asked Gus why he filmed his family's private crisis instead of putting his phone down. Gus shrugged and said he didn't really think about it. She asked if he understood that what he broadcast showed his family in a very difficult moment and exposed private information about his uncle and sister. He nodded but didn't look up. She explained he would have lunch detention for a week and mandatory meetings with the school counselor. The counselor's name was Marie Zhao, and she wanted to understand why he felt filming was more important than being present with his family. Gus finally looked up and asked if he was in big trouble. The principal said he wasn't in trouble exactly, but his choice showed poor judgment and a lack of understanding about privacy and family boundaries. She asked me if I had questions. I said no. She sent Gus back to class and asked me to stay. Marie Zhao came in a few minutes later carrying a folder. She sat down in the chair next to me instead of behind the desk. She said she'd watched the live stream and wanted to talk about what she saw beyond just Gus's choice to film it. I waited for her to tell me what a terrible parent I was, but she didn't. Instead, she asked how much positive attention Gus gets versus negative attention in our family. I didn't understand the question at first. She explained that from what she saw, Gus's older siblings had big problems that took up a lot of space and attention. She wondered if Gus had learned that causing chaos was the only way to get noticed. I thought about how I mostly interacted with Gus when he was in trouble or doing something wrong. I couldn't remember the last time I'd sat down with him just to hang out or asked about his day when nothing was going wrong. Marie said attention-seeking behavior usually meant the child wasn't getting enough positive attention through normal channels. She asked if Gus had activities or interests I supported, or if our relationship was mostly me correcting his behavior. I admitted it was mostly corrections. She made notes in her folder and said she'd work with Gus on better ways to get attention, but suggested I think about how to give him positive recognition before he had to create drama to get noticed. The meeting ended, and I sat in my car in the school parking lot for 20 minutes, thinking about how I'd failed all 3 of my kids in completely different ways. 2 weeks after the dinner disaster, I sat in a conference room at the school district office for Antigone's board meeting. The room had a long table with 7 board members sitting behind it and chairs facing them for witnesses and parents. Antigone sat next to me looking small in her chair, wearing the nice sweater I'd asked her to put on. The principal presented the case first, laying out the timeline of the medication selling. A school security officer testified about finding text messages on another student's phone arranging purchases. 3 students came in one at a time and described buying medication from Antigone during finals week and midterms. One girl said she paid $50 for 2 pills. A boy said he bought from her 4 different times over 3 months. Each testimony made the situation feel bigger and more serious. The board members asked questions about how long this had been going on and how Antigone got the pills to the school. She answered in a quiet voice that she brought them in her backpack and made sales in the bathroom or outside during lunch. One board member asked why she needed the money. Antigone looked at me and then said she wanted therapy but couldn't afford it. The board member asked why her parents wouldn't pay for therapy. I felt every eye in the room turn to me. The total amount came out during questioning. Nearly $2,000 over 4 months. I had no idea therapy was that important to her or that she'd been planning this for so long. The board took a 15-minute break to deliberate. We sat in the hallway and Antigone cried silently. I put my hand on her shoulder and she didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into it either. The board called us back in and read their decision. 2-week suspension starting immediately. Mandatory drug testing for the rest of the school year. 80 hours of community service to be completed by June. The board chair said that selling prescription medication was serious and illegal, regardless of the reason behind it. She said they understood Antigone was struggling, but that didn't excuse putting other students at risk. Another board member said parents had a responsibility to supervise their children and provide for their mental health needs. He didn't look at me when he said it, but the message was clear. They were judging my parenting even though they couldn't say it directly. The meeting ended and we walked to the car. Antigone got in the passenger seat and stared out the window. I asked if she was okay and she said no, but what did it matter? We drove home in silence. That night I finally called Feng Zhao's office and made an appointment. The receptionist had an opening in 3 days. I wrote it in my calendar and immediately wanted to cancel. Sitting in his waiting room 3 days later felt worse than I expected. The chairs were comfortable and there were magazines on the coffee table, but I felt like everyone could see that I'd failed at being a father. A couple sat across from me looking just as uncomfortable. Their teenage daughter scrolled through her phone between them. The receptionist called my name and I followed her down a hallway to Feng's office. He stood up from behind his desk and shook my hand. He had gray hair and glasses and looked like someone's grandfather. He gestured to a couch and sat in a chair across from me with a notepad. He asked what brought me in today. I explained the dinner incident and everything that came out. He listened without interrupting and took notes. When I finished, he asked me to describe my childhood and my relationship with my own father. I talked about growing up in a house where my dad ruled through fear and criticism. Nothing I did was ever good enough. He never showed affection or said he was proud of me. His way of parenting was to point out everything wrong and expect me to fix it. I heard myself making excuses for him as I talked. Different generation, he meant well. He made me tough enough to handle life. Feng wrote something down and then asked if I wanted my kids to make those same excuses about me someday. The question stopped me cold. I pictured Neil or Antigone sitting in a therapist's office in 20 years saying their dad meant well, but he was hard on them. The image made my chest tight. Feng said we'd talk more about that next time and scheduled another appointment for the following week. The second session started with Feng asking what I'd thought about since our last meeting. I admitted I'd been thinking about fear a lot. He asked me to explain. I said I was afraid my kids would fail or struggle or get hurt the way I did growing up. Feng nodded and said that was natural, but asked how I was trying to prevent their pain. I described my rules and expectations and discipline. He asked if it was working. I had to say no, given everything that happened. Feng explained the difference between authoritative and authoritarian parenting. Authoritative parents have rules but also warmth and flexibility. They explain their reasoning and listen to their kids. Authoritarian parents rule through control and punishment with little emotional connection. He asked which one I thought I was. I said authoritarian even though admitting it felt like confessing to a crime. Feng said my attempts to prevent my kids' pain through control had actually created different pain. The fear of my reaction made them hide their problems until everything exploded. He said my parenting came from a place of fear that my kids would suffer like I did, but fear-based parenting taught kids to be afraid instead of capable. The session ended and I sat in my car trying to process what he'd said. Everything I thought I was doing to protect my kids had actually hurt them. 2 days after that session with Feng, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number asking if I could meet to discuss supporting Liam better. The sender identified himself as Bert, Liam's sponsor from NA. I stared at the message for 10 minutes before responding yes. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown the next morning. I arrived early and sat in a corner booth picking at a muffin I didn't want. Bert walked in right on time, a guy in his 50s with gray hair and kind eyes who spotted me immediately. He shook my hand and ordered black coffee before sitting down across from me. He thanked me for meeting him and said he knew this situation was hard on everyone. I nodded and waited for him to continue. Bert explained that family understanding was crucial for recovery success. He said addicts needed support systems that respected their privacy and autonomy in their healing journey. I asked what that meant exactly. He said it meant not trying to control Liam's recovery or make decisions for him. It meant being available when he asked for help, but not hovering or checking up on him constantly. It meant treating his addiction as a medical condition requiring ongoing management, not a problem to be solved and forgotten. I took notes on a napkin even though I felt stupid doing it. Bert watched me write, and then said something that made my pen stop moving. He told me Liam almost relapsed the night of the dinner. I looked up sharply, and Bert's expression was serious. He said the stress and exposure of having his recovery revealed in front of everyone triggered Liam's shame response, which is a primary relapse trigger. Liam had called Bert at midnight from his car parked outside a convenience store where his old dealer worked. Bert talked him down for an hour until Liam felt safe enough to drive home. I felt sick hearing this. I asked if Liam was okay now, and Bert said yes, but it was close. He explained that shame makes addicts feel worthless and undeserving of recovery. When that shame gets triggered publicly, the urge to use again becomes overwhelming because the substance temporarily numbs that feeling. I said I didn't know, and Bert nodded. He said that's why he wanted to meet, to help me understand that addiction is a disease, not a moral failing. My brother needed support without judgment or me trying to fix him. He needed to know his family saw him as a person in recovery, not a problem to be managed. I sat with that information feeling worse than I had in Feng's office. Everything I touched seemed to break. Bert finished his coffee and gave me his number in case I had questions. He said Liam was doing well now and attending meetings regularly, but recovery was a lifelong process with ups and downs. I thanked him and sat alone in that coffee shop for another hour, thinking about my brother alone in his car, fighting the urge to throw away 6 weeks of sobriety because I couldn't control my anger at dinner. 3 weeks after the incident, Neil's math teacher called my cell during my lunch break. I stepped outside to take it, and she introduced herself as Mrs. Harris. She said she wanted to discuss summer school options for Neil to graduate on time. Her tone was surprisingly kind, not accusatory like I expected. She said Neil was a good student who got overwhelmed and afraid to ask for help. She told me she sees this often in students from high-pressure home environments. The comment stung, but I couldn't argue with it. She explained that Neil had been struggling since January, but kept trying to handle it alone rather than asking for tutoring or extra help. When he fell too far behind, he panicked and stopped turning in work altogether because he felt like the situation was hopeless. Mrs. Harris said this pattern was common and fixable with the right support. She suggested intensive summer school starting in June, meeting 5 days a week for 6 weeks. She also recommended twice-weekly tutoring sessions and regular check-ins where Meal could ask questions without fear of judgment. I asked if she thought he could actually pass, and she said absolutely, if he had the right environment and support system. I scheduled a meeting with her and Meal for the following week to create a plan together. The meeting happened in Mrs. Harris's classroom after school on a Tuesday. Meal sat next to me looking nervous and tired. Mrs. Harris pulled out a folder with his grades and assignments, showing us exactly where he stood and what he needed to complete. She created a detailed schedule for summer school and tutoring that would get him caught up by August. I watched Meal's face as she talked and saw him relax slightly when she made it sound achievable instead of impossible. She asked him if he had questions, and he asked about the college he'd already paid a deposit to. I'd been wondering the same thing but hadn't figured out how to address it. Mrs. Harris said she'd help us contact the admissions office to explain the situation. She thought they might agree to defer his enrollment one semester if he completed summer school successfully. Meal looked at me and I nodded. We called the college together from Mrs. Harris's phone and spoke to an admissions counselor who was understanding about the situation. They agreed to hold his spot until January if he could provide proof of summer school completion and passing grades. Meal actually smiled for the first time in weeks. We thanked Mrs. Harris and walked to the parking lot together. In the car, Meal said he was sorry for not telling me sooner about the math class. I said I was sorry for making him afraid to ask for help. That night after dinner, I asked Meal if we could talk privately. We sat on the back porch and I forced myself to bring up Tim. I said I wanted to understand what was happening with him and his feelings. Meal looked surprised that I was asking calmly instead of yelling. He said he'd been seeing Tim since February, and they'd kissed a few times, but nothing more serious. He said he wasn't sure if he was gay or bi yet because he was still figuring things out. I nodded and tried to keep my face neutral, even though I was working hard to control my initial discomfort. Old thoughts kept pushing up about what this meant and what people would think. Meal watched me carefully, and then said he'd been terrified to come out because I'd made comments about real men and toughness his whole life. He said he didn't think I'd accept him if he wasn't exactly what I expected. Hearing him say that out loud made my chest hurt. I asked him what comments specifically, and he listed several I barely remembered saying. Things about boys who acted feminine or men who weren't athletic. Jokes I'd made about guys being soft or weak. Each example hit like a separate punch. I said I was sorry for making him feel that way. He shrugged and looked away. I told him I didn't fully understand his experience, but I loved him and wanted to support him. I said I was clearly learning as I went and would probably mess up sometimes. Meal's shoulders relaxed a little. He said he appreciated the honesty more than false enthusiasm. He said he didn't need me to suddenly become a Pride Parade organizer, he just needed to know I wouldn't reject him. I promised I wouldn't. We agreed to keep talking as he figured out his identity, and I worked on my outdated assumptions. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was honest, which felt like progress. The following week, I took Antigone to her first appointment with Yuki, a therapist who specialized in adolescent anxiety. I paid for it without complaint this time, writing the check in the waiting room while Antigone filled out intake forms. She disappeared into Yuki's office for 50 minutes while I sat reading magazines I didn't care about. When she came out, her eyes were red, but she looked calmer. She didn't tell me what they discussed, and I didn't ask. We went to 3 sessions like that before Yuki asked to meet with me separately. I came in on a Thursday afternoon, and Yuki invited me to sit in the same chair Antigone probably used. She had a gentle way of talking that reminded me of Feng. She said she wanted to discuss Antigone's anxiety triggers with me. I nodded and prepared myself for more bad news about my parenting. Yuki explained that Antigone's anxiety was severe and had been worsening over the past 2 years. She said my explosive reactions and constant criticism had been major sources of stress for my daughter. Antigone lived in fear of disappointing me or making mistakes because she knew I'd react with anger. That fear created a cycle where her anxiety made her more likely to mess up, which triggered my anger, which increased her anxiety. Yuki drew a diagram showing how this cycle worked. I stared at it, feeling sick. Yuki continued explaining that Antigone had been having panic attacks at the school for over a year. I sat up straighter and said I never knew that. Yuki said that's because Antigone hid them in bathroom stalls during passing periods. She'd learned to time them so she could get to a bathroom, have the attack alone, clean herself up, and get to class before anyone noticed. The medication helped her focus on schoolwork, but did nothing for the underlying anxiety. That's why she was so desperate for therapy to learn actual coping strategies. She needed tools to manage the panic attacks and address the root causes of her anxiety, which included our family environment. I asked what coping strategies Yuki was teaching her. She listed several, including breathing techniques, grounding exercises, cognitive reframing, and identifying thought patterns. She said Antigone was a quick learner and was already using some of these tools successfully. I asked what I should do differently at home. Yuki said to notice when Antigone seemed stressed and respond with curiosity instead of criticism. Ask what she needs instead of telling her what to do. Give her space to make mistakes without explosive consequences. I wrote all of this down like I had with Bert. That weekend, I asked Antigone if we could talk. She looked wary but agreed. We sat in the living room and I apologized for dismissing her anxiety as not real. I said I was sorry for making her feel she had to sell medication to get help. I told her I understood now that anxiety was a real medical condition that required treatment. Antigone listened without looking at me. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she said she didn't forgive me yet. The words hurt, but I nodded and said I understood. She said she appreciated the apology, but I'd been dismissing her feelings for years and one conversation didn't fix that. I asked what I could do to rebuild trust. She said keep going to therapy yourself and keep paying for hers without complaining. She said stop reacting to everything with anger and actually listen when she tries to talk to me. I agreed to all of it. Antigone said she'd keep working on our relationship in family therapy sessions, but forgiveness would take time. Later that week, I told Fung about the conversation, and he said Antigone's response was healthy and appropriate. He said immediate forgiveness after years of damage would actually be concerning. Real healing required acknowledging the harm and working through it slowly. The viral video fallout reached my workplace on a Monday morning 3 weeks after the dinner. I was at my desk when a coworker stopped by and asked if I had a minute to talk privately. We went to an empty conference room and she showed me her phone. Her teenage son had recognized our family from Gus's live stream and shared it in their parent group chat. Now dozens of parents from the kids' schools had seen it. She said she wanted to give me a heads up because people were talking. I felt my face get hot as I watched 30 seconds of the video showing me yelling at my kids and Liam's confession. The view count was over 50,000 now. I thanked her for telling me and went back to my desk feeling exposed. An hour later, my boss called me into his office. He closed the door and said he needed to discuss personal matters affecting my professional reputation. He'd received calls from 2 clients who'd seen the video and were concerned about my judgment. He said he wasn't going to fire me, but I needed to understand that my family's dysfunction was now public knowledge, and it reflected on the company. I apologized and said I was working on the situation with therapy and family counseling. He nodded and said he hoped I'd get it sorted out. The conversation lasted 10 minutes but felt like an hour. I walked back to my desk past coworkers who definitely knew about the video based on how they looked at me. The humiliation was complete. My failures as a father were now entertainment for thousands of strangers and a liability at work. That evening, I pulled into my driveway and saw the Hendersons next door suddenly remember they needed to go inside when they spotted my car. Mrs. Henderson had been watering her garden, but she grabbed her hose and walked straight to her garage without looking my way. The next morning, I took out the trash and caught 3 neighbors standing in a cluster at the end of the street, and when they saw me, they stopped talking immediately and scattered like I had a disease. At the grocery store on Saturday, I ran into Coach Phillips from Meal's old soccer team in the cereal aisle. He looked at me, looked away fast, and pushed his cart in the opposite direction, even though he was heading toward the checkout. The cashier, who usually made small talk with me, kept her eyes down the whole transaction and didn't say a single word beyond the total. Walking through the parking lot, I heard 2 women whispering behind me and caught the words, "that video," and "those poor kids," before they noticed me turning and went quiet. The public shame felt like wearing a sign around my neck that said I was a bad father, and everywhere I went, people either stared with pity or pretended I didn't exist. By Sunday, I started ordering groceries for delivery because I couldn't handle one more person's judgment or fake sympathy. On Monday afternoon, I sat in Marie's office waiting while she finished her session with Gus. When my son came out, Marie asked if I could stay for a few minutes to discuss something important. She closed the door and explained that Gus had been very open in their sessions about why he filmed the dinner. He told her that chaos was the only time I gave him my full attention, that normally I was either yelling at Meal about college or dealing with Antigone's problems or working late. Marie said Gus felt invisible most of the time, like the family forgot he existed unless he did something dramatic or got in trouble. The gambling ring at the school started because he wanted to feel smart and important, like his older siblings, and filming the dinner was his way of making sure someone noticed him, even if it meant negative attention. She showed me notes from their sessions where Gus had drawn pictures of our family with himself tiny in the corner, while everyone else was big and fighting. Marie explained that both the gambling and the live stream were bids for recognition from a kid who felt overlooked and unimportant in his own home. That conversation hit me like a truck, because I realized I barely knew what Gus did with his free time or who his friends were. I could tell you every detail of Meal's scholarship applications and Antigone's therapy schedule, but I couldn't name Gus's favorite subject or what he wanted to be when he grew up. Marie suggested I start weekly one-on-one time with Gus doing activities he chose, not what I thought he should do. The first Saturday I asked him what he wanted to do, and he looked suspicious, like I was setting up a trap. He picked going to the comic book store downtown, and we spent 2 hours there while he showed me different Pokemon cards and explained the game rules. I had to fight every urge to criticize how he spent his money or tell him he should read real books instead. The next week, he wanted to get ice cream and walk around the park, and I managed to just listen while he talked about a kid at the school who was mean to him. The third week, we went to the arcade, and I watched him play games for an hour without once suggesting he should be doing homework instead. It felt wrong at first because I was so used to every interaction being about correcting or teaching, but slowly, Gus started actually talking to me about real things instead of just giving one-word answers. A month into our weekly time together, Gus admitted during one of Marie's sessions that he started the Pokemon gambling because he wanted to feel important and smart like Meal and Antigone. He said Meal got attention for sports and grades, and Antigone got attention for her problems, but nobody paid attention to Gus unless he caused trouble. The money from gambling made him feel powerful, like he was good at something and people respected him even if it was kind of scared respect. Marie worked with us to develop a plan where Gus would return all the money he won to the kids he took it from, and he'd write apology letters explaining what he did was wrong. She also helped us figure out ways for Gus to feel recognized that didn't involve breaking rules, like letting him help me with projects around the house or asking his opinion on family decisions. Gus agreed to the plan but said he was scared the kids at the school would hate him after he gave the money back. I told him doing the right thing was hard, but it was better than living with guilt, and I was proud of him for being brave enough to make it right. 6 weeks after the disaster dinner, I decided we should try another family meeting. I thought maybe we'd all grown enough to actually communicate without everything falling apart. We sat in the living room on a Sunday afternoon, and I started by saying I wanted us to check in about how everyone was doing with therapy and school stuff. Neil said summer school was going okay, and his teacher was actually pretty helpful. Antigone said her sessions with Yuki were helping her manage her anxiety better, and she'd only had one panic attack in the past 2 weeks. Gus talked about returning the gambling money and how some kids were actually cool about it. For about 10 minutes, it felt like we were a normal family having a normal conversation. Then I made the mistake of asking if anyone had concerns they wanted to discuss, and Antigone brought up how I still got visibly uncomfortable when Neil mentioned Tim. I got defensive immediately and said I was trying my best, and Neil jumped in saying trying wasn't the same as accepting. I felt my voice getting louder as I explained that this was all new to me, and they needed to give me time. Antigone shut down completely and stopped talking. Gus pulled out his phone. Liam tried to mediate, but I snapped at him that this was about my kids, not him. Within 15 minutes, we were right back to the old pattern of me trying to control everything. The kids going silent or defensive and everyone walking away frustrated. I sat alone in the living room afterward, feeling like a complete failure who couldn't even manage one successful family conversation. The next day in my session with Feng, I told him about the failed meeting and how discouraged I felt. He nodded like he'd expected this and said that change takes time and setbacks are totally normal parts of growth. He explained that my expectation of quick fixes was part of the authoritarian mindset I was trying to break, that I still wanted to solve problems immediately and check them off a list. Real family healing required patience and consistent effort over months or years, not weeks. Feng said the fact that we even attempted another meeting showed progress, and the fact that I recognized the old patterns emerging meant I was becoming more aware. He reminded me that I'd spent 17 years parenting one way, so 6 weeks of therapy wasn't going to magically transform everything. The goal wasn't perfection, but gradual improvement, and I needed to give myself and my kids grace for the stumbles along the way. 2 weeks later, Liam invited us to his NA meeting for family support night because he was celebrating 90 days of sobriety. We drove to a church basement across town, and I felt nervous walking in because I'd never been to anything like this before. The room was full of people sitting in folding chairs arranged in a circle, and they welcomed us warmly without any judgment about the video or our family mess. Liam stood up when it was his turn and talked about his journey through addiction, how he'd hit rock bottom and lost everything before deciding to get clean. He thanked his sponsor Bert for the support, and thanked us for letting him stay with our family even after the dinner incident exposed his recovery. Other people shared their stories, talking about relapses and struggles and small victories, and I started understanding that addiction wasn't about being weak or making bad choices. These were regular people with jobs and families who got sick with a disease that hijacked their brains and required ongoing treatment. One woman talked about being clean for 5 years and still going to meetings 3 times a week because recovery was a daily commitment. A man shared about losing custody of his kids during his active addiction and slowly rebuilding that relationship now that he was sober. Every story made addiction feel less like a personal failing and more like a complex medical condition that required compassion and support. After the meeting, Bert pulled me aside and we talked more about supporting Liam properly. He explained that I'd been trying to save my brother by letting him stay without really addressing his recovery needs, which was a form of enabling even though my intentions were good. Other family members at the meeting had shared about codependency and how trying to fix or rescue addicts actually prevented them from taking ownership of their recovery. Bert said the best support meant respecting boundaries and letting Liam own his journey, being there when he asked for help, but not trying to control his process or protect him from consequences. He told me that Liam almost relapsed after the dinner video because the exposure triggered massive shame, and shame was one of the biggest relapse triggers for people in recovery. I realized I needed to stop treating Liam like a project to fix and start treating him like an adult managing a serious health condition who needed respect and space along with support. 2 months after the dinner incident, I was sitting in Feng's office for my individual therapy session, working through my childhood stuff. We'd been slowly unpacking my relationship with my own father, and it was harder than any of the family sessions because I had to face things I'd buried for 30 years. Feng asked me to describe what it felt like being a kid in my house, and I started talking about walking on eggshells constantly, never knowing what would set my dad off. I remembered being terrified to bring home any grade less than an A, hiding report cards in my backpack until the last possible second. I talked about how my father never said he was proud of me or gave me a hug, how every interaction was either criticism or silence. Feng asked what I needed from my father that I didn't get, and I felt this huge weight in my chest as I tried to answer. I needed him to see me as a person instead of a project. I needed him to accept mistakes without rage. I needed to feel safe and loved instead of constantly afraid. Feng said I was grieving the father I needed but never had, and that grief was necessary to break the cycle, so I didn't pass the same trauma to my own kids. The following week, I had a breakthrough session where everything I'd been holding back just broke open. Feng asked me to talk more about specific memories with my father, and I started describing this time when I was 8 and accidentally broke a window playing baseball in the yard. My dad had screamed at me for an hour, called me stupid and careless, then made me pay for the replacement window with my birthday money. I remembered standing in the kitchen crying while he yelled, feeling like I was the worst kid in the world for one accident. As I told Feng this story, something shifted, and I started actually crying in his office. Not just tearing up, but really sobbing about how scared I was all the time as a kid. I cried about never feeling good enough, about learning that love was conditional on perfect behavior, about becoming an adult who didn't know how to be soft or kind because I'd never experienced that myself. Feng let me cry without trying to fix it or make it stop, and when I finally calmed down, he said my father's approach had damaged me deeply. He validated that the fear-based childhood I experienced was emotional abuse, and I wasn't weak or wrong for wanting something different for my own children. He said recognizing that damage was the first step toward healing it, and the fact that I could cry about it now meant I was finally letting myself feel the pain I'd been running from my whole life. The school year ended on a Friday in mid-June, and I drove Neil to his first summer school session on Monday morning at 7. He looked nervous walking into the building carrying his backpack and a coffee I'd bought him at the drive-thru. I watched him disappear through the doors and realized I hadn't yelled at him once during the car ride, hadn't lectured him about working harder or being more responsible. Antigone finished her last community service hour that same week at the food bank downtown, sorting donations into bins for 4 hours every Saturday for 2 months. She came home tired but seemed lighter somehow, like completing the requirement lifted something heavy off her shoulders. I picked her up each week and we'd stop for smoothies on the way home, not talking much but just being together without fighting. Her suspension ended and she returned to the school for final exams, texting me updates about each test instead of hiding her grades like before. Yuki told me during one of our parent check-in sessions that Antigone was practicing breathing exercises when she felt panic starting, actually using the coping tools instead of just pushing through until she broke down in a bathroom stall. I asked Antigone about it at dinner one night, and she showed me the technique, breathing in for 4 counts and out for 6, and I tried it with her, even though it felt awkward and forced at first. Neil asked if he could bring Tim over on a Saturday afternoon in early July, and my stomach clenched when I said yes, but I forced myself to sound normal about it. Tim arrived at 2 carrying a bag of chips and wearing a band shirt I didn't recognize, shaking my hand with a firm grip and looking me in the eye. I offered them drinks and snacks, trying to act like I had friends over all the time instead of standing in my kitchen feeling completely out of my depth. They went to Neil's room to play video games and I could hear them laughing through the door, and I realized my son sounded happy in a way I hadn't heard in months. Tim stayed for dinner and told a funny story about his summer job at the movie theater, and Antigone asked him questions about the new releases, while Gus showed him his Pokemon card collection. I watched Tim interact with my kids naturally, and saw how Neil kept glancing at him with this soft expression, and something in my chest loosened slightly. After Tim left, Neil hugged me in the kitchen and said thanks for being cool about it, and I hugged him back even though cool wasn't the word I'd use for my internal panic. Antigone had a bad anxiety day in late July where she couldn't get out of bed for school, texting me from her room that her chest hurt and she couldn't breathe right. I remembered what Yuki taught me about validation instead of dismissal, so I sat on the edge of her bed and told her I believed her symptoms were real and we'd figure it out together. She cried and I just stayed there, not trying to fix it or tell her to toughen up, just present while she worked through the panic attack using her breathing exercises. We called Yuki together and did a phone session right there in her bedroom, and afterward Antigone said she felt like she could try going to the school for afternoon classes. I drove her at lunchtime and walked her to the office to sign in late, and the secretary gave us a knowing look but didn't ask questions. Yuki told me later that my response during that episode probably prevented a bigger crisis, that Antigone felt safe enough to ask for help instead of hiding and making it worse. Marie scheduled meetings with me and Gus throughout June to create the repayment plan for his gambling money. We sat in her office with a spreadsheet showing every kid he'd taken money from and how much he owed each one. Gus had to use his allowance and birthday money to pay everyone back in installments over 3 months, and Marie supervised him writing individual apology letters to each kid, explaining what he did and why it was wrong. I watched him struggle with the letters, erasing and rewriting multiple times because Marie wouldn't let him use generic language or make excuses. One kid's parents called me angry about the whole situation, and I apologized and explained what we were doing to address it, feeling my face burn with shame over my son's actions. Gus handed out the last payment and apology letter in August, and he came home quiet and subdued in a way that seemed genuine instead of performed. Marie told me in our final meeting that the process was hard for him but necessary, that he learned more from making real amends than any punishment I could have given. Feng recommended a parenting support group that met Thursday nights at the community center, and I forced myself to go, even though walking into that room full of strangers felt worse than my first therapy session. There were 8 other parents sitting in a circle with coffee and cookies on a table in the corner, and the facilitator asked everyone to share one struggle they were facing. I listened to a mom talk about her teenager's eating disorder, and a dad describe his son's suspension for fighting, and I realized these people weren't judging me for being a bad parent because they were all dealing with their own versions of family crisis. When my turn came, I talked about the dinner incident and the therapy we'd started, and multiple people nodded like they understood exactly what I meant. A woman named Sandra talked to me after the meeting about her own journey with authoritarian parenting patterns, and she gave me her number in case I wanted to talk between sessions. I went back the next week and the week after that, and slowly the shame about needing help started to fade into something more like relief, that I wasn't alone. Liam came home in mid-July with news about a job offer from a logistics company downtown, and he showed me the offer letter with shaking hands like he was afraid I'd find something wrong with it. The position paid decent money, and the hiring manager knew about his recovery because Liam had been honest during the interview, and they were willing to work around his NA meeting schedule. I told him I was proud of him and watched his face crumple with emotion, and he admitted he'd been terrified I'd criticize the job or tell him it wasn't good enough. We talked about his apartment search, and I helped him look at listings online, and I realized our relationship had shifted from me trying to manage his life to me supporting the choices he was making for himself. He moved into a 1-bedroom place in August after 3 months of living in our basement, and the whole family helped him move his stuff in one Saturday afternoon. Liam seemed lighter in his own space, and when he left our house that night, he said he'd see us at Sunday dinner, making it clear he was choosing to stay connected instead of just being stuck with us. Neil's summer school teacher called me in early August to say he'd passed the class with a B, which meant he was officially cleared to graduate and start college in January. She told me Neil had asked for extra help multiple times and stayed after class to work through problems he didn't understand, showing initiative she wished more students displayed. I asked what changed from the regular school year, and she said she thought Neil felt safer asking questions now, like he wasn't afraid of being judged for not knowing something. I met Neil at the school after his final exam and took him out for lunch to celebrate, and he talked about his college plans without the fear and stress that had surrounded the topic for months. He seemed genuinely excited about starting in January instead of devastated about the delay, and I realized the extra time had given him space to figure out what he actually wanted instead of just doing what he thought I expected. Our family therapy sessions with Feng shifted in August from crisis management to actual skill building, and we practiced communication exercises that felt awkward and forced at first. Feng taught us active listening where we had to repeat back what the other person said before responding, and it slowed down our arguments enough that we could actually hear each other instead of just reacting. Antigone brought up something that bothered her about my criticism, and I managed to listen without getting defensive, then acknowledged her feelings before explaining my perspective. We weren't perfect, and sometimes sessions still got tense when old patterns emerged, but we were having real conversations instead of explosive fights that ended with slammed doors. Feng pointed out our progress during one session, noting that we'd gone 3 weeks without a major blow-up and were addressing problems before they became crises. Antigone stopped me in the hallway one night in late August and said she wanted to tell me something. I braced myself for bad news, but she just said she was proud of me for going to therapy and working on myself, and the words hit me harder than any criticism she'd ever given. She said she could see I was trying to change, even though it was obviously hard for me, and she appreciated the effort I was putting in. I stood there in the hallway not knowing what to say, and she hugged me quickly before going back to her room. I went to my own room and sat on the bed replaying her words, and I realized that might have been the best thing any of my kids had ever said to me. Marie called me in for a final session about Gus in September, and she showed me her notes tracking his behavior over the past 3 months. His attention-seeking actions had dropped significantly as he got more positive recognition at home for things like helping with dinner or doing homework without being asked. She said he'd developed better skills for managing his emotions instead of acting out when he felt was ignored or overlooked, and his teacher reported improvement in classroom behavior as well. Gus seemed more settled somehow, less desperate to cause chaos just to feel important. I'd been making time for one-on-one activities with him each week, and he'd started coming to me with problems instead of creating problems to get my attention. 3 months after everything exploded at that dinner, I ordered pizza for our first real family meal since the incident. Nobody wanted to risk another cooking disaster and the stress that came with it, so I called in 3 large pizzas and breadsticks and told everyone to show up at 6. Meal arrived first and helped me set the table with paper plates instead of the good china, and I noticed he didn't seem nervous like he used to whenever we planned family gatherings. Antigone came down from her room without me having to call her 3 times, and Gus actually put his phone away without being told. Liam showed up right at 6 carrying a 2-liter of soda, and we all sat down at the same table where everything had fallen apart months ago. The conversation started awkward with everyone careful about what they said, but then Gus made a joke about the pizza place forgetting napkins again, and Neil laughed and suddenly we were just talking like normal people instead of walking on eggshells. Antigone told a story about something funny that happened in her therapy group, and I listened without jumping in to fix or criticize, just let her share her experience. Liam asked Neil about his college plans, and they talked about dorm life and class schedules, and I realized my brother and my son had developed their own relationship, separate from my control. The tension was still there under everything. I could feel it in how carefully we chose our words and avoided certain topics. but there was also something warm and real that had been missing before all the secrets came out. After we finished eating, I suggested we talk about some new family rules, but this time I wanted everyone to help decide instead of me just announcing what would happen. Mia looked surprised, and Antigone actually made eye contact with me for the first time in weeks. We agreed to have weekly family meetings where everyone could speak without getting interrupted or shut down, and I promised to listen even when I disagreed or felt scared about what they were telling me. Gus suggested we each get individual time with me doing something we actually wanted to do, not just stuff I thought was important, and I agreed, even though it meant giving up control of our activities. Antigone asked for an open-door policy where they could come to me with problems without fear of immediate punishment, and I said yes while fighting every instinct to add conditions and rules to that promise. We all committed to therapy for whoever needed it, no questions asked and no judgment about seeking help, and I included myself in that promise because Feng had taught me I needed support too. Liam cleared his throat and said he had something to share, and my stomach dropped, thinking another crisis was coming. He told us he'd been looking at apartments now that he was stable in his new job, and his recovery was solid, and he wanted to move out by the end of the month. My first reaction was feeling rejected, like I'd failed to make him comfortable enough to stay. But then I recognized that old pattern of making everything about me and my feelings. Instead, I told him I was proud that he felt ready for that step, that it showed how far he'd come in his recovery journey. We agreed he'd still come to family dinners every week, and that our home was always open if he needed support or just wanted company. Neil said he wanted to officially come out to our extended family at the next holiday gathering, and he asked if I would support him when some relatives reacted badly. I told him yes without hesitation, that anyone who couldn't accept my son wasn't welcome in our lives anymore, and his eyes got wet, but he smiled. Standing up for him felt more important than anything else I'd done as his father, more than any sports game or grade or achievement. Antigone finished her community service hours the week before by volunteering at a mental health awareness organization downtown, and she said the experience made her want to become a therapist someday to help other kids who felt unheard by their parents. I told her she'd be amazing at it because she understood that struggle personally, and she actually reached across the table and squeezed my hand for a second before pulling back. Gus interrupted to tell us about his new Pokemon card trading club at the school, talking fast with excitement about how his teacher agreed to supervise, and they were setting up official trading rules. I listened with genuine interest instead of immediately looking for problems or ways he might mess it up, asking questions about how the club worked and what made it fun. He lit up talking about it, and I realized this was what Marie meant about positive attention changing his behavior patterns. Our family wasn't perfect and probably never would be. We still had bad days where old patterns emerged, and we fell back into criticism and defensiveness. But we were honest now in ways we never were before, telling each other hard truths instead of hiding behind secrets and fear. The kids trusted me enough to share their struggles, and I'd learned to respond with support instead of anger, even when I felt scared for them or disappointed by their choices. Therapy taught me that being scared was okay, that wanting to protect them was natural, but controlling them through fear and punishment only pushed them away. I looked around the dinner table and saw my 3 kids laughing with their uncle, all of us still healing but genuinely connected in a way we hadn't been before. Neil was comfortable enough to hold hands with Tim when they came over now, and Antigone talked openly about her anxiety without shame. Gus brought his Pokemon cards to show me without worrying I'd confiscate them or lecture him about wasting time. Liam attended his meetings and called his sponsor when he struggled, and he trusted us enough to share when recovery got hard instead of hiding and suffering alone. The viral video that exposed our dysfunction ultimately forced the honesty we desperately needed, and while the journey had been painful and humbling, we were building something real and lasting together.